My initial vision for the game was that you had a cat which fell asleep on some construction materials, and then while asleep the cat gets carried to the top of a skyscraper, where the cat then wakes up and runs around realizing they're stuck, and then this is where the player takes control. My idea was to make this a rage quit platformer, as I'm a big fan of platformers, and rage quit platformers are generally smaller games, as they often typically only have one level. I'd also never seen it done with a semi-realistic cat. They had platforming in Stray, but the platforming wasn't manually controlled, so it was a very different gameplay style. The main idea I had for the cat platforming game, when I first thought of it, was that you would have the cat stuck on the skyscraper, and then they would have to get down to the ground, hence the name Only Way Is Down.
The prophecy is true.
I thought this would be cool, as the player would get a view over the city, and if the player misses the jump, the cat would ragdoll, which I thought would be kind of funny, as I always like ragdolls in games. One of the most important things in any platforming game is the jump mechanic, and in Only Way Is Down I wanted to make the cat jump cover quite a bit of distance, so as to make the platforming quite exciting and a bit nerve-wracking. I also wanted to give players the ability to move while in the air, so as not to be too unfair and allow players to correct their jump if they've jumped in the wrong direction. I spent many days playing around with the jump mechanics, testing with different combinations of air control, while still trying to keep a fairly realistic look to the movement. Once I was happy with the jump mechanics, I went about testing it in my skyscraper level, and after a few minutes I could see it work well, and thought it could turn out to be a cool game. As the game idea is small and focused around this one level, I thought it'd be cool to have the menu start on this level with the cat looking out from the top of the skyscraper over the city, with the camera behind them, and then when the game starts the camera just zooms out a bit to the game camera and the game begins and the player has control. I thought this would be a cool transition and a smooth way to start the game.
Nice.
As I've already been developing my other game, Slaughter Cats, for around 3 years now, I'd built a good framework which I could extend to this new game, and thought this would help speed up the development dramatically. So I ported a lot of the existing systems into Only Way Is Down. I wanted to get the menu set up, as I thought it would be relatively quick. I wanted to see if I could get the menu to game transition working successfully, and just see how it looked and whether it was good. I began by modifying the style of my existing menu setup and changing around the menus to fit the new game. After around a day, I'd managed to get the basic menu set up. It looked pretty good at this point, and while there was still a lot more to do, it worked at this point and looked vaguely okay. I played around with the camera transition for quite a while, trying to get the camera to correctly transition from a menu into the game, and eventually managed to get it to work correctly, and thought it worked really well and was a cool way to start the game. Having got a basic menu set up, I really wanted to focus on the platforming sections and started building it out so I could really decide how the gameplay was going to be. Initially, I was a bit undecided how I wanted the gameplay to work, whether I should give the player the ability to freely roam the environment and find their way to the end, or have a set path that they have to travel. I ultimately decided that it made a lot more sense to have a set linear path that players would have to follow, as with how the level is set up, giving the players freedom to get to the destination would mean that some players would be able to glitch the system if they were skilled enough, for instance jumping to areas they aren't supposed to, or jumping down floor by floor. Also, as I was trying to make this a rage quit game, I felt that if the gameplay style was too open, the player might try to go to areas where they'll die, and while this is normally okay in games, if you're 20 minutes into a run in a rage quit game and you jump to the wrong spot and die because you didn't know where to go, this could be extremely frustrating, so I thought a more linear experience made more sense. The ragdoll aspect of the game was quite important for me, as I personally really enjoyed games which incorporated ragdolls, and I think it fit well with the silly tone I had in mind for this game. As well as the cat ragdolling, when the player died I wanted to have some over-the-top dramatic, almost like choir music, but slightly more impactful and sad to juxtapose with the cat ragdolling to make it even more stupid and funny when the cat died. Although I decided on having a linear platforming playstyle, due to the nature of the environment being on top of a skyscraper, it's not so obvious for the player where they need to go sometimes. Other rage quit games like Only Up, which this game's name takes some obvious inspiration from, the direction of the player has to go is obvious as it's always up, but for this game, as it's a large environment, it's not always clear if you can make the jump or whether you'll die dropping to a certain area. I also had made certain platforms which I wanted players to jump to in order to progress, and again felt it wasn't necessarily obvious that if they didn't jump on these platforms and jumped on the floor instead, they would die. I decided I'd add a kitty cat sense mode similar to spider sense in some of the Spider-Man games, which essentially leads you where to go. I thought this would also add a unique mechanic to the game. I wanted this mode to, while also showing the player where to go, to show the world differently, again similar to the spider sense effect in some of the Spider-Man games. I added some post-processor effects and set up a system so the player can turn it on and off via button press. I set a trail leading to a landing zone, which the player must land on in order to progress to the next part. Landing on the zone would then trigger the next trail. I decided to have the trails appear after each other, as having them all on screen at the same time may be too much on screen and confuse the player about where they have to go. I made the post-process effect intentionally quite blurred, as I wanted to have the kitty cat sense mode to be more of a helper than something players have on all the time. I'm hoping players use it to help and switch it on when they're unsure of where to go, rather than having it on constantly. Once I was happy with the core gameplay, I decided I'd work on the surrounding environment, as while the immediate environment did look good, the surrounding area did not match the same quality. If the player died and fell off the skyscraper, which would be likely to happen many times during the game, then the roads and the environment around the player looked very basic and did not match the quality of the main skyscraper. I began by adding more realistic roads to the environment using splines to set up roads all around the immediate visible area. This looked okay, but still looked quite bland. I then added more decals to the road at the intersections and lane lines, and then added a lot of static vehicles to the environment to again add a bit more variety. Around the roads I added pavements and some more park-like areas with seats, bins, lamps and trees to give the environment a bit more life. It's alive! I then started adding a lot more buildings around the skyscraper to give the impression of a very vertical city, and wanted the buildings to almost fade into the background as the environment is so densely populated with skyscrapers. I thought it looked good, but the city lacked a bit of life, so I wanted to add cars driving around the streets to make it look more vaguely populated. I spent a long time working on the system to get cars moving around the city. I had a ton of issues with performance and getting the AI controllers to work correctly. And while it does work most of the time now, there are still some remaining issues with performance and the AI controllers which I'll look into and fix before the final release of the game.
Great.
I decided I wanted to create the initial vision I had for the story, which would play when the game starts, to give a bit of background to the player as to why they are where they are. While my environment at this point was good, I thought it lacked the detail I wanted for the story cinematic. I could have spent some time upgrading the environment for this specific cinematic, but I thought it would be good to make use of the Unreal Engine Matrix demo city instead, particularly for the very first scene, as I wanted to make it seem like it was a busy city and the character messages and vehicles in the Matrix demo city were really good. I thought this would be a great way to save time, as trying to create something which even looked half as good would take a very long time to do. I imported the assets I needed into the Matrix demo project and sent them up to work as needed, and began by using Tape Recorder to record in-game animation sequences, and then used these recordings in Sequencer, editing them quite extensively and taking many recordings to test what worked and trying many minor variations to get the best shots. Eventually I got the right few shots I liked after a few days of work.
Yeah, boy. That's it.
I then repeated the same process in my own project for the second part of the cinematic where the cat is on top of the skyscraper. After testing many different shots and camera settings, I finally came up with a sequence of scenes which I think worked well. I thought there was definitely room for improvement, but at this point I'd spent a couple of weeks working on it, and this was only meant to be a smallish project and I didn't want to spend too long working on it. The final part was to add music to the cinematic. I wanted to start off with some chill, lo-fi background music and then transition into some more thoughtful and sad music. Eventually I found the right couple of songs which worked well and thought they really brought the cinematic to life. I was really happy with the end result and thought it came out as good as what I had imagined when I initially came up with the game idea.
That's a 10.
At this point it's still only my third proper animation which I've worked on in Unreal Engine, and while I definitely don't enjoy it as much as working on the game directly, I was proud of the result I produced and really happy in how it all come together. I also had the idea to have the cat switch buildings at least once in their descent to make the environment a little more varied. I wanted to do this transition between buildings with cranes, so I had to add movement to my cranes. I went about setting up the cranes to have movement and really wanted the cargo of the crane to have physics. While setting up the crane to have basic movement was relatively straightforward, setting up physics to be used with the cargo was complicated. The main issue I had was the cat was able to interact with the cargo, and while this was the effect I wanted, for instance when the cat was on a certain side of the cargo would tilt slightly more in that direction. Unfortunately though, it meant the player could glitch the physics, and if for instance they were running into the cargo wires or hook, this would affect the physics in very unrealistic ways. While this was amusing, players could potentially do this unintentionally, and at the point in the level where I intended to use the cranes, the player would be quite far into the game, so I don't want to frustrate the player even more and potentially have them die as a result of some wonky physics. After many days of experimentation and not really finding a solution, I came up with the idea of having the physics enabled cargo hidden in the game, and then I would simply replicate its position to a non-physics enabled cargo. This way the cargo would move as though it had physics, but the cat would be unable to affect the cargo. I was really happy with the result and thought it was a novel solution and really liked the way the cargo moved with quite realistic physics. I had an aim of releasing a demo for the game for Steam Next Fest, as I'm aware these Next Fests are always a good way to promote your game and get feedback. I've been working on getting the demo part of the level complete, making sure while the sections were very difficult they were still possible to complete, and that given your skill improved you should be able to complete the platforming every time with little issue. When testing the level, while I liked the jumping sections, I thought some of the traversal areas where you had to walk along girders were a little too simple and not all that fun as it was too easy. One problem, like most games, was that you only had to have part of the character mesh on a platform for the character not to fall, so you would have half of one paw on a girder and the rest of the cat off over the edge, and the cat would remain in place. While for most games this isn't too bad, as the characters are typically humanoid bipedal characters, with a four-legged cat this issue was even more obvious and looked really bad. I decided to add in a feature where if the cat has two or more paws off an edge, the cat would lose its balance, similar to real life. When the cat loses its balance, I made the cat Ragdoll, and this would most of the time lead to death, as the cat would often fall to an area where they would die. But if the cat's body is mostly in an area where it can stand, the cat will recover after 2 seconds. After testing, I really loved this mechanic. I thought it made the traversal sections a lot more interesting and challenging, and it meant that it wasn't just a case of getting from A to B. It was a unique mechanic which I don't remember seeing in any other games, and thought it really helped add another unique element to the game.
Really great.
I started the level off right at the top of the skyscraper with an open area, as this allowed players to get used to the controls and explore and look over the level a bit before they start the descent. The player then goes through a series of fairly easy platforming sections before the difficulty starts to ramp up. I realised that I needed some basic tips to help guide the player, as finding the way to go isn't necessarily obvious for all players, and most players won't check the controls in the menu. I started by adding a tip to tell the player to use kitty cat sense to show them where to go. Then as the player progresses to a girder section, I thought it would be a good idea to explain to the players the mechanic where if the cat has 2 feet or more off the floor, the cat will ragdoll. This would help players understand the mechanic of the game and why they ragdoll when they do, and hopefully mean they're more aware of where the cat's paws are going forward. I had another tip in the lead up to the first landing zone to let players know where they have to land on a specific area, as it isn't necessarily obvious unless you use the kitty cat sense. I then added another tip to let players know they have to crouch to get through the next section. I added the crouch mechanic because I wanted to have as many different elements to the gameplay as possible, as only jumping and moving from A to B can get boring quickly in platformers. The final tip I added was to inform players that they can move slowly and therefore make more precise movements when they turn or move. This was to help them move more carefully through some of the more difficult traversal sections ahead. I thought one thing which was missing, which is arguably the most important thing in any cat game, is the ability to meow. So I added a few meows which I thought fit well, and added a meow animation which could be used in almost any scenario. Another couple of options I thought were fun to use was a ragdoll mode and a slow-mo mode, so decided to allow these in gameplay. I was also a little bit undecided as to whether to allow players to change the style of the cat, as in my cinematic, trailers and promotional material I'd always use the same orange cat, but I ultimately thought it would be a feature that a lot of players wanted, as I'm sure there would be quite a lot of players who want to play as a certain type of cat. One other feature which I thought would be good was to add the ability to interact with physics-enabled objects. Thought it would be fun to have an action where the cat can knock or push certain objects within the environment, so I added in this ability. While it kind of worked, the physics of the objects that the cat would interact with were behaving very unreliably, often seemingly getting stuck in place or being very hard to move. I decided to disable this feature for the demo and come back to it after the demo was released, as I didn't want to waste too much time on trying to figure out a solution. Hopefully it will be in the final release of the game, if I can get it working in a way which is fun and reliable. I got to the point where my game demo was ready, I thought, or at least it seemed that way. I then started testing the performance on other systems, including lower end systems, and soon came to the realization the performance was not good, and also that the existing jump system I built was being affected by different FPS rates. So on some computers the cat would jump much higher and further than I intended. This obviously was not acceptable, as players needed to have reliable logic within the game. If the cat jump distance is sometimes varying, this is going to make players extremely frustrated. I then went about redesigning the jump system to make sure the height and distance were always the same regardless of the frame rate. Once that issue was fixed, I wanted to try and optimize the game as much as possible. I wanted it to be as widely playable as possible. After a lot of time investigating performance through testing and using Unreal Insights, I identified there were 4 main issues, which were the cars were overspawning, shader complexity was too high for some materials, shadow detail was too high, and also a lack of using static mesh instances. I fixed an issue whereby the cars were spawning too much, meaning there was a huge amount in the level. I identified there was also another issue with the cars, which I think is related with Chaos Vehicle system, but was unable to identify the exact cause. So I had an option to disable the traffic if players were having issues with performance. I'll have to revisit this and fix all the issues with the cars before the final release. One of the other main issues was shadows, as there is thousands of objects in this level which covered a massive area, and as the lighting is dynamic, the cost for shadows was huge. I went about adjusting all the settings for shadows in the scene to reduce the quality to an acceptable level. The cost is still large, but reduced significantly from what it was before. I had a huge amount of objects in my scene, so I went about converting all my static meshes into static mesh instances where possible to help with performance. Lastly, I had a few very complex materials which were used widely in my scene. I went about reducing the complexity of these materials. This also meant the quality was reduced somewhat in certain circumstances, but I did this to a point where I thought it was acceptable. Unfortunately, optimization is often a trade-off between quality and performance. After fixing those 4 main issues, the performance was significantly improved, and I was happy with how the game ran on the systems I tested on. I then began getting some people to test the full demo. Generally the feedback was positive. People did say it was very hard, and this was okay as it was intended. One thing which was mentioned, which I'd also been thinking about, was the lack of music. At this point there was no music, as I was still a bit undecided whether I wanted any. I had sound effects of the wind and traffic around the city, which I think added a bit of ambience, but I wasn't sure if this was too plain. Ultimately, I decided that it would be a bit bland and maybe get boring without any music to engage the player a bit more. I want to have some basic mellow or uplifting instrumental songs to play while people are playing. So I chose some acoustic guitar songs and instrumental piano songs, which I think work well. I then released my demo for Only Ways Down on Steam over Steam Next Fest. I'll release a part 2 of the devlog soon, and the game's available on April 1st on Steam if you want to check it out.
Nice.